There we go. Pastor Braden introduced last week the plan to go through the Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what's known as the Sermon on the Mount. Very familiar verses to many people with a lot of different ideas, right? But our focus for this series is represented by this slide, and just the idea of, okay, let's take a look at what Jesus actually taught, why he taught those things, and understand that in most cases, or it's kind of a flip upside down picture of the way we humans usually think and approach things. All right, anyway, I jump slides. We always start here at Mission Gathering with this very important statement. Here in our community, what we say, what we present, is not like the answer. This is what you must believe. The idea is to share things that have been important to us, things from our own experience, to be able to start a conversation, whether it's with yourself or with someone else, with the Lord, hopefully, too, included. So, I was given the privilege today of talking about these first 12 verses, which is what we generally hear spoken of as the Beatitudes. I don't know where that came from, but that's because it starts with the blessed are you when. The challenge is that you could spend a month on each of those verses. Easy. I mean, we spend a year on them. So that's obviously not going to happen this morning. So what I'm going to try to share with you is just the overall concept of how to look at this, or how we can look at this, and for your further thoughts and meditations. And I'm going to start with verse 1. For when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, and then we know and we've heard these. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And we go down the list, and you think, what? This is not usually things that we associate with happiness, right? Which is the root of the word blessing in this context. But then we see the results. When this happens, this is the result. And you think, okay, that sounds better. Hey, I'm in for that part of it. But, okay, do they really have to be tied together? Can I not have the nice red part without the other part? Before I get into it too much, I found this kind of paraphrase, which I kind of like better. So I'm not going to read the other. I will read this. You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. Less of you means more of God and his rule. When you feel like you've lost what's most dear to you, only then can you be fully embraced by the one who's most dear to you. When you're content with just who you are, no more, no less, that's the moment you find yourselves more proud of everything that can't be brought. When you've worked up a good appetite for God, he's the best, most complete meal you'll ever have. When you care for others, because at that moment of being careful, full of care, you find yourselves fully cared for by God. When you get your inside world, your mind and heart, put right, because then you see God in the outside world and in others. When you can show people how to cooperate instead of competing or fighting, that's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. When your commitment to God provokes persecution, this persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom and his grace. So Here's a statement. Actually, this slide, or this combination of slides, I pulled from my message on the 31st of December, right? When we talked about blessing and fruitfulness and all pruning versus everything. So again, we all agree. There's no argument that we all want a life full of blessing. We all want to be happy. I don't think there's anybody that would say, no, I don't think I want that. But do we all want to accept and the things that Jesus taught lead to this conclusion? So we all normally naturally want the results. But again, when it comes down to, okay, are we willing to do what's necessary to get those results? That's where it comes. That's where the challenge comes in. But I want to take that first verse again to kind of give us a little clue as to how we can approach it and how our thinking can be changed, our perspective can be changed. It can change our thinking so that we see things in the right way, and then we don't freak out at the process to get the results that we want. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside, right? Number one. And he sat down. Number two. His disciples came to him. Not all the crowds. He spoke to crowds. But in this case, he went up. After that effort, he sat down in that place. His disciples came to him. And he began to teach them. So let's talk about the mountaintop, right? And what that signifies, just the fact that Jesus went up to a mountain. It doesn't have to be a really high mountain. It wasn't like he climbed Mount Everest. Right? There's not really super high mountains in that part of the world anyway. But it was just from where you were down. The human perspective is what? We're always looking at things. We're here. God's there. We're here. Heaven's there. We're here, and we have that saying, you can't see the forest for the trees. We're so often in that position. Because when we're down here, that up there seems really small, and this seems really big, what's right next to us. But when we reverse that, when we're on the mountain, what happens? Those things that seem so big, and I think we've all experienced a mountain in some way, right? We maybe didn't climb it, but we drove up or helicoptered up or whatever. But you know what happens. The things that seem so huge when we're down here, totally change their dimension, their perspective when we're up here. So again, everything that when Jesus came, it was to bring that top-down perspective instead of the normal human bottom-up perspective. But there isn't an escalator to the top, to that view, right? We don't get to pay for a helicopter to take us up there. There are steps involved. Jesus went up the mountain. There were steps to get him from where the crowds were to that place. And if we're going to share in that perspective, there will always be deliberate steps that we need to take to get us out of ourselves. And again, it goes back to, I've mentioned, and I'll always mention, the follow me part. Right? This isn't something we have to figure out for ourselves. It's really as simple as follow me. We have an example. We have teachings. There are steps. And then we have the guidance of the Spirit that God gave us when we turn to him. And it's a matter of following. So, we know from our experience, to get that heaven perspective takes those deliberate steps, which in many cases, if not most, literally feel like an uphill climb. It takes an effort to get us from where we are by nature to where and what God wants us to see. So, how many times do we say, I don't see it that way, right? How many times do we hear that or say it ourselves? I don't see it that way. It's important to note that God's perspective is not something we're gonna see it that way automatically. It's going to take that walk up to where Jesus is, to find that place, and then sit down. So we make the effort, and then what happens so often? We're making the effort. I'm going to find this place. I'm going to look at the perspective, and then we don't sit down. Remember, Jesus went up the mountain, and then he sat down. Just that place of settling in, and that's also an effort. Sitting down is an effort for some of us, especially, right? Because we're going. And then willing to be taught. He began to teach. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. I want to take a minute here to kind of notate the difference between a student and a disciple. A student is a learner of facts and figures, kind of understood, right? We have students in school. We were all students in school. We're students in different things. We come to work. We have a new job. We get new responsibilities, and we have to learn. But it's more of a student thing in many cases. We can come to church as a student as well. We can hear, we can gather information, and then yay, we're good. The disciple is different, and especially in the time of Jesus, it was more like what we would call today an apprentice, where it was actually a live and learn, a learn by doing. So it's more not learning the answers, it was learning the method. And that's crucial. And if we're going to get Kevin's perspective, it's not a pill that we take in the morning and then all of a sudden we see. There is a process, there is a method, and that's where we want to learn. So, learner, a student ends up with knowledge, a knowledge base. A disciple, that's where the practical experience and what we call wisdom comes in. It's applied. So, these are two words, radical, progressive. Especially in our community, we hear that a lot, we use them. I want to take a minute just to kind of define what those are, at least for me. Radical is something very different than the usual or traditional. It's favoring extreme changes in existing views, habits, conditions, or institutions. Progressive. First of all, the root word is happening or developing gradually or in stages, step by step. Favoring or advocating progress, change, improvement, or reform as opposed to wishing to maintain things as they are. We get the movement? So, bear with me. I'm going to throw something at you. Just let's take a look at this. Jesus wasn't radical or progressive in the sense of wanting to be different or trying to make a statement. We consider ourselves a progressive church not because we necessarily, we're out there, we want to make a statement, political or otherwise, social. Jesus lived and taught. What he lived and taught was radical for his day, but it's radical for our day. If we just take God's perspective, heaven's view of what Jesus actually lived and taught, it was radical, and it will always be radical in the definition, because it wasn't, nor is, nor ever will be the normal way of human thinking and viewing things. So everything that Jesus taught, in that sense, was radical. And following Jesus in his perspective that he shared, heaven's perspective, the top-down perspective, will always be radical, because it will always be very different, if not opposing, to our normal way of doing things, to our normal way of thinking, to what we hear around us every day from others who are human like we are. His lives and teachings are and will always be progressive because they all involve a step-by-step journey forward from where we are by our human nature to where and what God is by his divine nature. Agreed? So, Jesus said, this wasn't something he came up with to introduce a new theology or a new doctrine or a new. I have not spoken on my own. The Father who sent me commanded me what to say. It was different, radical, progressive in its essence because it was that top-down, the Father perspective versus the normal, natural, bottom-up that we will otherwise have without having this introduced into our lives and experience. So, we're just going to talk about just that whole concept of blessing and happiness. What's happiness? Because, yeah, right. Poor, mourning, persecuted, merciful, which means that I can't be merciful until somebody does me wrong, right? Otherwise, mercy only comes into play when somebody's messed up and it affects you. And here's why. Those who are blessed or happy in God's perspective, in Jesus' teaching, are not blessed according to the conventional meaning of that word, which usually we would take to be, good fortune, life free of hardships, which even when we have those moments, and we're very happy to have those moments, naturally, but they're mostly short-lived and quick to change. Those moments of happiness, the human natural moments of happiness, are few. Or even if they're many, they're not constant. So when Jesus was talking about happiness, he was referring to people who might possess nothing, be hungry, humble, afflicted, humiliated, endure hardships, and be persecuted. The circumstances of life may turn against them, yet life cannot take that happiness from them because life did not give it to them. And that's the key. I spent 8 years of my ministry in Romania, and the beginning, half of that was when it was still communist. Life was difficult, really difficult. We have no idea here in this country, fortunately. Right? When trying to share the message of hope, the teachings of Jesus, the concept of what God is able to do for us all, there was absolutely no way they could even begin to promise that their physical life and situation would ever be different. At that point, for those first years, there was no way of knowing that that wall would ever come down, that there would ever be a change, that they would ever be free, that they would ever have enough to eat, that they would ever be comfortable in their natural life, that they would be a day free to worship as they felt without being persecuted. There was no way to promise that. Could not promise that. So that's pretty depressing. Until we understand that the message of God, the message of the gospel, the good news, and the teachings of Jesus have nothing to do with that being changed. That is not what our happiness is tied to. That is not what our blessing comes from. That the whole concept of we can be happy, we can be satisfied, we can be full, we can be content, we can be all those things that happiness is derived from, no matter if our outward circumstances are horrific. And that's pretty radical, right? Because it's a reversal of all of the normal human values and way of thinking. So again, there's no way to go into all 12. You don't want to be here that long. But I'm going to take one. Because it has a special meaning to me. And I'm not going to go into the experience behind it. But that's where often when we have, for those of us who have privilege of having a different language and being able to read the Bible and to read the scriptures in a different language and then experiencing those things in a different country, often that will lend a different perspective. God is able to show a different perspective because it's so different from what we just grew up with. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, not very popular here, right?
Very true.
Especially, we're talking about the world in general, but let's talk about us right now in this time right here in the United States. Meek is not a happy word, right? It's not something, oh, that's what I want to be for Christmas. No. Unfortunately, especially now, in our day and age, it's very strongly embedded that everything appears to be happening based on what's in it for me. Now, we feel it acutely now, but the truth is, right, Jesus was talking about this 2,000 years ago. Meekness wasn't any more popular in his day than it is now. Right? The world's around another 2,000 years, meekness isn't going to all of a sudden gain popularity. It's not ever become the thing to be or to do. Meekness is usually tied to submissiveness, cowardice, lack of strength result, right? Weakness. So let me introduce, I won't go into all the different languages, but just a simple lesson from Spanish. Meekness in Spanish is manso. It's that way in the scripture. And in many of the Latin languages, in the translation of the Bible, it's the same thing. Meekness is translated as manso. Manso in Spanish means tame. Now, let's talk about tameness in its context in Jesus' day and how we can, the analogy that we can use to understand that better for us today. The mountaintop, sit down, experience with Jesus version. No weakness. Has to do with inner strength, humility, self-control, and manso, meek, right? The concept of the yoke of the animal pulling. So manso, tame, is used to describe, especially in this context, an animal like a horse or a mule that's harnessed for work, where all of its power and its energy is focused on getting the work done. Now, is a horse automatically born to pull the plow? What happens on the horse that's never been even ridden on the first time you ride it? Right? Chaos. The strength is all there. The power is all there. But as long as that strength and power being used in its own mind and automatically fighting any desire to be controlled, poof. So, awesome, power, but no harvest that way, right? Could be used for bronco rodeos, and that's about it. But not a day to night. It's not an overnight. You don't feed it a special bale of hay and then it becomes tame. There is a process. But over time, a horse that is tamed, becomes meek, doesn't lose its power, doesn't lose its strength, doesn't lose its ability. It actually gets enhanced because it gets focused for a specific purpose. It gets focused to be able to produce a harvest. So again, let's think of meekness in the concept of the yoke that Jesus talked about, because that's what he was talking about, that harnessing, that changing what direction you're given. A yoke gives direction, a yoke gives purpose, a yoke gives meaning, and often a yoke means you have help, right? Because in many cases, the yoke, like we saw in that picture, which is still a picture you see in a lot of countries in this world, not so much in the United States anymore, but probably more countries in the world than not, that's the way things get done out in the field. That's how we eat. That's how we get our vegetables and fruits, and well, not fruits so much, but vegetables and grains. But again, Jesus said, take my yoke. Because why? We were created to be happy, but we were created to serve, not be served. And Jesus says, what, the greatest of you, who is the one that controls everything? Who serves, who is controlled by God, who is controlled by a different perspective, who is controlled by a radical way of thinking that is outside of what the me part of it. And that is a part of following. Jesus was. If we follow him, the process, the result of the process is to be like him in that sense also. So, we're all called to check our impulse, surrender our wills to God's will, and serve others to the glory of God. Yay! But we're not, people aren't doing black flips all across the street to do that. And yet, blessed are ye. You want to be happy? Stop where you are. Take some steps. Just here you are. Take some steps up the mountain. That's where Jesus is. Sit down there. Not because we sit down. This is where I'm at. This is what I want. This is what I think. I was born this way. I'm going to die this way. Well, yay, but don't expect to be happy very often or for very long. When we do that, when we accomplish it, and again, it's a discipleship, it's an apprenticeship, it's a journey, it's a continual process to learn and experience. But if we can exercise ourselves in that, when we're upset, when we're going crazy, when we don't like where things are, whether it's in a moment of self-reflection, we don't like where we are or what we are, but most of the time it's going to be we don't like where everybody else is. I'm fine, but everybody else is messed up. Instead of sitting down in that, if we want to be happy, we have to come out of that. Different perspective, right? Meekness, or being tamed under God's control, will guide us there. Then what? We inherit, it says the meek shall inherit the earth. Well, we don't really want this, right? But the earth is just it's a eternal legacy that comes way far and above beyond anything that, like Jesus said, or the scripture says, more than we can comprehend or even think. When we're viewing things from the bottom. It's hard to see that. But it is fully acceptable. It takes a little bit of time. It takes following. But it's God's plan for all of us who are disciples. Follow up on the mountain, sit down with him there, and live with heaven's viewpoint. Can we do that? If we don't feel happy, and we want to be happy, recipe. It'll work every time, which is awesome. So, we're going to go now to communion. Frank, this sounds great, but, right? What happens tomorrow, the next day? We have to understand and have grace for ourselves too. And this is a process, but we need to be committed. Right? The discipleship goes to commission. That the commitment is part of it. So Jesus chose these men to follow him. He asked them to follow him. They left where they were sitting. They came to him. Now, the night before he was crucified, he came and did something that was simple and yet very symbolic. He knew what was going to happen next. They didn't. But he did that. He did something very, very important. And he took something that was very, very natural. Bread, wine. Very common, very natural. There would have been a lot of things tied to that for them. Everyday, daily things. And he put a new meaning. He radically changed the meaning of bread and wine in a very progressive, step-by-step way. And he did it with these people that were very, very far from perfect. They were very, very, very human and flawed. And that was okay. Because it was his blessing for them for the journey. It was him trying to help them understand, if you do this, you remember me in this way, you can't even begin to understand the blessing that you will have in your life. You want to be happy? Just do that. Here at Missiongathering, we do believe in an open communion, which means everyone is welcome. No matter what you're feeling today, or where your beliefs are, or where you are in your journey, what Jesus is prepared for us to share in is always available to anyone who wants.